Definitely appreciate that. Before I get started today, I do want to remind everyone again, both on site and online, that I always put a lot of PowerPoints in and a lot of words, and I have created PDFs of those PowerPoints, and I have emailed those to Dave, who will be the distribution center to share those PDFs from yesterday's talk, from today's talk. And yesterday I mentioned because I'm using to some extent my work with Peyote and the Native American Church as a case study for some of the stuff that I'm talking about. I mentioned yesterday the chapter that I had on border policing, Peyote and Indian country, that appeared in this publication from the University of Texas Press, which I've just found out a month ago is about to go into paperback form now, if you want to purchase it. But I have scanned a copy of that chapter, and within the copyright parameters of educational purposes, Dave will also send that to you if you choose to want to read. You don't have to, but impressed with the work. So I encourage you to, take note. Yesterday we talked, I got to make sure I hit the right button. Yesterday we talked about incursions. And today, this morning, Joshua focused as well on the second part of our theme, resistance and integration. And that is also what I want to focus on this afternoon. Native Americans remain determined to control their own destinies despite the pressures exerted on them to assimilate. And religion played a crucial role in the formulation and execution of various strategies intended to ensure the survival of Native communities. As a powerful medium for cultural innovation and communication, religion, I'm going to let you define it after our conversation yesterday, facilitated a range of responses to the challenges presented by U.S. colonialism, and I would even say Canadian colonialism. Native Americans' resistance to total assimilation really was dynamic, shifting along a continuum in which accommodation or even militancy, or maybe a combination of both, could be expressed to address the particular political circumstances faced at any given time. And the fact that Native Americans survive with unique cultural distinctiveness, reflective of tribal differences, never ceases to amaze some of those integrationists. Historically, Indigenous peoples have used both confrontation and conciliatory acts as adaptive strategies to resist total assimilation into a dominant social system and a true loss of cultural integrity. And so we want to talk today about some of those ways that they did that. Some of the more substantive reactions to Christianity can really be summarized as criticism, and I would include in there theological criticism, syncretism, or acculturation, probably I think I tend to use more, or even revitalization. And so those are some of the things that I am going to focus on today. And I want to start with this idea of resistance and revitalization, and the ideas of the dreamers and the prophets. Who knew there were Native American prophets in American religious history? Because some of you know, you studied, but we tend to not think about those and talk about them as well. We can go back, there are many, but we can go back to the Delaware prophet Neolin, also known as Pontiac, who was setting about to unite over 20 tribes against the British and Amherst policies and the effects of colonization. His rebellion that he led, it's called Pontiac's Rebellion if you look in the history books, but it's really Neolin's rebellion. The Delaware religious prophet, as opposed to the Ottawa warrior Pontiac, but it's the prophet who inspired the rebellion with visions that urged natives to reject European technologies, i.e. guns, commercial relations. We've talked a lot about economics, and alcohol, because alcohol was not a part of indigenous culture in the Americas until the arrival of Europeans. And of course, to expel the British from their lands. So he encouraged Indians of different tribes to consider themselves as one people, forging for the first time really kind of a pan-Indian identity, if you will. But that religious, visionary aspect of resistance to white culture. Handsome Lake of the Seneca people, again, had fought the British against the Americans during the Revolutionary War and confined to a reservation, an area that the federal government had started to set aside for Native Americans after they had lost their homelands. So this process of dispossession of land, even before the 1830 Indian Removal Act, is a part of the creation of federal Indian policy. In 1799, Handsome Lake called for a rebirth of Seneca culture that would blend Native American customs with American colonial culture that Native Americans had already contributed to. Colin Calloway's book, Encounters in New Worlds, talks about this dynamism, if you will, of the sharing of different cultures in colonial America. Handsome Lake, as I mentioned, Seneca Turtle Clan, born veteran of the Revolutionary War, but speaking to the Haudenosaunee people, who at this point were in a terrible spot because of war, because of alcohol, because of poverty, and because of dispossession of land issues. And so the prophet, the religious leader of the Haudenosaunee people, preached, along with his corn planter and red jacket, preached a message that combined again traditional, whoops, I think I'm one over, that combined, nope, I'm not, that's the one I want. Traditional Haudenosaunee values with Christian theological doctrines. And you really start to see a lot of the Christian theological doctrine coming out, first supported the code of Handsome Lake, the Seneca prophet. Handsome Lake, and there's a story with some of the prophets in Native American traditions. He collapsed after suffering from alcohol abuse, perceived to be dead on the floor of his cabin. And as his body was being prepared for burial, his half-brother corn planter discovered a warm spot on his chest, which slowly spread throughout his entire body. And finally, Handsome Lake awoke and said he had been visited by 3 radiant beings who had sent him back with a message for his people. And the code of Handsome Lake is to reconcile human beings with the Creator. All of this has come about, he says, because your ancestors took it from the white man. You have suffered because you have assimilated too much into that culture. By drinking to excess, you violated the will of the Creator who blew life into all of you. The Creator says that to be drunk is to forbidden, and he wants you to stop it and stop with your evil ways. So this call back to some of the traditional values that grounded Native Americans within the community. And it's really interesting, if you read more of the prophecies, there is heaven is the new world in the Seneca prophecy, the land of the Creator, knowing the Creator's will. And there's also in his prophecy an underworld a dark region beneath the earth's surface where the creatures of the devil or the tormentor have been imprisoned. So you really do start to see this fusing of some of Christian theological doctrine with some of the prophecies and the traditional beliefs of the Seneca Haudenosaunee people. And then we have, the Shawnee prophet, Tenskwatawa. Tenskwatawa, also known as the prophet, was born in 1775. His mother had abandoned him. He lacked some of the physical abilities of his other siblings. His elder brother, you probably know better, Tecumseh. And because of his frailty, they refused to train him in hunting and fighting. In fact, it was said he was so unskilled with the bow and arrow that he blinded himself in his right eye with a wayward arrow. As an adult, he became reliant upon the kindness of other tribes people to feed him and his family, but he also turned to alcohol to forget his problems and quickly became, of course, dependent. And again, when the medicine man of the tribe died in 1804, Tenskwatawa quickly proved to be able to meet some of the people's needs. And a familiar story. In 1805, he fell into a deep trance. His family believed that he had died, and they were preparing his body for a funeral when he regained consciousness and revealed that the master of life, the Shawnee deity, had visited him and told him that the Ohio American Indians must give up all white customs and products. And this is a recurring theme of Native American prophets, to give up the dependency on white culture, white products, guns, cookware, glass beads, and of course, alcohol, and return back to some traditional ways of life. And if you do that, you will be rewarded then to be able to drive the white settlers away from your land. And notice too, Tenskwatawa also says that you natives must also stop fighting with each other over land and respect the tribal elders. And he takes a name change there, Tenskwatawa, the prophet, and grows a following, even to the point that there is a village that he establishes in Greenville, Ohio, Prophetstown. Until the governor of Indiana Territory, William Henry Harrison, fears the prophet's growing power and following and dares the prophet to prove his powers. He does, thanks to the eclipse and the prediction of some of the scientific things that are happening in nature. But it's Tecumseh who's forging this pan-Indian united front against the military and working with this confederation that becomes linked in with his brother's religious movements to try to force whites back to their side of the proclamation line of 1763. Tecumseh and the prophet, of course, in Prophetstown, it's near the Tippecanoe River in Indiana Territory in 1808. And it's William Henry Harrison who leads an army against Prophetstown in 1811. He kind of stops his force a little distance from the village. Tecumseh is away, and so Tenskwatawa has to lead, but he lacks the military skills, and the Shawnee are defeated. And so while the American army drives the natives out, burns Prophetstown to the ground, and by all efforts, Tenskwatawa loses some of the credibility there during that battle. Tecumseh is also killed as well. For the remainder of his life, though, Tenskwatawa tries to seek some power among the Shawnee. Ultimately, he just moves a lot and is really dependent upon others to take care of him. He dies in November 1836. But he was one of the catalysts for one of the greatest American Indian alliances in U.S. history, and yet he dies virtually a forgotten figure. And yesterday I mentioned another prophet, a couple of prophets, Tavabo with the ghost dance. And then the second wave of the ghost dance with the Paiute prophet Wovoka, who revives the movement in 1889. And I think my next slide with this pictures, it got cut off, but it is Wovoka. And as I mentioned yesterday, the ghost dance spreads from Utah with the Paiutes to the northern plains. And we got the massacre of Wounded Knee against the ghost dancers because the federal government feared the number of natives that were gathering to celebrate their religious practice and told the troops to fire upon them. The ghost dance, if you read the regular history books, the ghost dance died at Wounded Knee in 1890. It did not. It came down to Oklahoma, to Indian Territory, to Kansas, to Indian Territory, and it survived even into the early 20th century. Indian agents are still writing and reporting about the ghost dance movement that's taking place. I list this book. It's really it's a pricey book, but if you're into it and you can get the library just to read, it is a great book. Coming Down from Above by Lee Irwin, Prophecy, Resistance, and Renewal, takes these prophets as well as so many other Native American prophets from different traditions. And even, I think, maybe some reference to some two-spirit prophets that Irwin has discovered and done some work. Again, it's a very pricey book, but if you can get it on sale somewhere, a used copy, it's really a valuable resource for this. Now let's return to my research. Peyote. This idea of resistance, and this idea of resistance that comes from being able to adapt. The native prophets that I mentioned are all some syncretism and acculturation with white culture, but a lot of it is let's reject that and let's return to our traditional ways. Folks within the Native American church that gets incorporated in 1918 are trying to figure out how to protect their right to religious freedom as espoused in our wonderful Constitution. Of course, never mind that Native Americans aren't U.S. citizens yet, but how do we get our rights to religious freedom? And the idea to legally incorporate in 1918 in Oklahoma. It's where it starts. And in their articles of incorporation, you see the names of the various tribal entities and representatives. But notice down at the bottom in Article 1, the name of this like all of your incorporated documents, the name of this corporation shall be the Native American Church. They're using a word from white culture. This is church. It's not a building. Although the Osage, with all of their money, did build some more permanent structures, and the Dene people, Navajo, built some permanent structures. No pews, an altar made of dirt in which Grandfather Peyote is placed and sits. It is an all-night ceremony. Starts at sundown, and you are seated, and there is a fire keeper and a fire that is built and tobacco that is smoked and drumming and hymn singing in native languages and the ingestion of dried peyote buttons, or if you prefer, mixed in hot water as a brewed sort of tea. And while the drumming is occurring, the sitting and the singing and hoping that Creator speaks. You get breaks during the night to stand, to stretch, to get water. And then peyote woman at sunrise, because peyote is first revealed to woman lost in the desert, thinking that she is going to die. And the Creator says, no, take that plant with you and you will survive. So peyote woman, an honored role, comes and breaks the ceremony with food at sunrise. A different form of church. And so while they are incorporating, they are using the language of church to say, we have a religion. That's Tisa Winger's title of her book on the Pueblo and their battle over dances and peyote as well in that process. You see some of the religious ceremonial aspects. The gourd rattle, the peyote fan, the drum, the box that keeps the cedar and the peyote and all of the other essential parts of providing the ambiance ceremony. As I said yesterday, it starts and incorporates in Oklahoma. It quickly expands up to the northern plains and they incorporate. And then ultimately, in the 1940s, 1950s, it becomes the Native American Church of the United States. And then it goes north of the border to Canada, and then it becomes the International Native American Church. But this membership card here from 1955. So-and-so of the Navajo tribe is a member in good standing of the Native American Church of North America. That's the international version. Notice the card says fighting for freedom of religion and is entitled to all the rights, privileges, services, etc. And it's really interesting that the Native American Church of North America, even by now in 55, that's including Canadian peyotes, has an American flag on it. I mean, there's just a cognitive dissonance sometimes with the patriotism that is expressed in Native American cultures when so many of their citizenship rights, voting rights, religious rights have been denied to peoples for so long. And yet embracing this idea of being American. But the card and the membership card become important by 1955. It's not a Schedule I drug until like 1973. But from 1916 until 1937, every single year, Congress tried to pass legislation to ban peyote. And from 1916 until 1937, every single year, Native American peyotes were successful in defeating Congress. And part of that was because Robert Owens, a senator from Oklahoma and a Native American, had been elected to Congress. And even though he was not a peyote, was speaking out on behalf of Native peoples, which is why representation in politics is also important. And to help get legislation that is favorable for Native Americans. But more interesting than that is Article 2 of the incorporation in Oklahoma in 1918. The purpose for which this corporation is formed is to foster and promote the religious belief of several tribes of Indians in the state of Oklahoma in the Christian religion, with the practice of the peyote sacrament as commonly understood and used among the adherents of this religion in the several tribes of Oklahoma, and to teach the Christian religion with morality, sobriety, industry, kindly charity, and right living, to cultivate a spirit of self-respect and brotherly union among the members of the native race of Indians, including therein these various tribes in Oklahoma. This article is just chock full of so much to unpack. First of all, When peyoteism begins coming from Mexico and gets transformed into an American religion with the Kiowa, the Comanche, and the Apache in southwest Oklahoma, it is no Christian elements. It is traditional language. It is claimed as a new Native American religion. When it starts to spread to the Osage and the Otoe-Missouria and then over to the Quapaw, you have the influence of Jack Wilson, who adopts the ceremony, changes the altar to make it in the form of a cross, and starts to add Christian hymns. You go to the northern plains, Albert Hensley and John Rave, who place a Bible on the altar next to peyote. And they're doing baptisms in peyote. I mean, it's truly a Christian document. And so this idea of Christian religion for peyoteism in 1918 in Oklahoma is really kind of something new. But the fact that they're calling it a sacrament, because folks, in 1918, prohibition is the law of the land. Remember, peyote had already been compared to being akin to alcohol. And so we know with prohibition, there were religious exceptions for whom? Catholics and Jewish people, right? Jewish ceremonies that use wine and the Catholics. And particularly from Catholicism, the idea of it is a sacrament. And so adopting the language to protect the practice. And then you unpack that Christian religion, morality, sobriety, industry, and all of those things. There's a lot there about acculturating some to Western culture, as well as communal nature of traditional beliefs. But this is a document really for the first time from natives where there is a native race. This term race suddenly starts to appear within the confines of talking about the Native American church. So they're successful for a while in resisting the encroachment, but ultimately, like I said, once the 1960s and all of the white hippies started going down to South Texas and trying to do their own recreational use of peyote as a mild hallucinogen, the federal government suddenly starts to take note again that we need to do something. And this time, because whites are a little more impacted, they are able to get it on a Schedule I drug. And so those who grow peyote in South Texas, in those 4 counties from that map yesterday, again, you have to be a licensed peyote dealer, peyotero, to buy and to sell peyote. And the documentation now, and the way that this federal government has surveillance over the lives of indigenous peoples, the distributor authorization card, the employee authorization card, and a receipt for the sale of records, proof of membership in the Native American church, that document from 1997 there. Interesting for a people out of oral traditions and stories, how the federal government demands a written record. Much like the identity cards placed on the table yesterday. And as I mentioned, climate change, commercialization of the land in those 4 counties, you can see farmers decided to plow up some of the fields and destroy the root. You're not supposed to pull the peyote cactus out by the root. You cut off the buttons off the top so that it continues to regenerate. But a lot of farmers just decided to get out of the business and plow the fields. Climate change has also impacted those peyoteros still growing. The drought has been hard. In spite of that, though, the Native American church in North America still continues to thrive. The Gilcrease has this Woody Crumbo artist, the peyote ceremony. So I think that's really important to think about ways that Native Americans were able to utilize white culture, utilize terminology of white religion, and for a long time able to protect at least their religious right. They still have the right to practice peyote, but it is much more restricted now with the documentation. So let's talk just a little bit too about indigenous Christianity. Joshua, you set it up perfectly this morning with some of those oral histories of people who were raised in Christian homes and the impact there. I want to take us back to remember, even in colonial times, Native Americans such as Samson Occam were embracing parts of Christianity, preaching, writing hymns, that acculturation. And yes, while Joshua, you made mention, and I think it's appropriate, the forced conversion from the colonial encounters was truly cultural violence. But the fact that a lot of Native peoples voluntarily accepted Christianity once it came to this continent, we have to start dealing with that. And we have to start thinking about what does that mean to develop then an indigenous Christianity, to adapt Christianity with indigenous culture. And so we get women like Kateri Tekakwitha, who is now, isn't she a saint now in the Catholic Church? Yes. Just up the road from us here is the Cathedral of the Osage, the Immaculate Conception Catholic Church in Pawhuska, Oklahoma, which is known for its stained glass windows. It's also known as the Cathedral of the Osage because the sanctuary stained glass windows depict Osages being evangelized by Jesuit priests called the Black Robes. And interestingly, these windows were made in Germany. They were hidden during World War I, but they had been commissioned by Osage families to depict real Osage people. And in fact, the Vatican had to give permission for these unique stained glass windows to be placed in the church. It's a beautiful building in a tiny little town. I mean, Pawhuska is tiny. But you see the inside and the grandeur of this old Catholic church. Here's a better view from the balcony looking down, and you see all of the varied stained glass windows. But specifically, you see the Osage people depicted. Representation matters. I made a visit a few years ago to the church, and they have now added next to the parking lot of the church their own little garden for Kateri Tekakwitha, and a beautiful indigenous cross there and a statue of her. It really is a nice little garden area to walk around. These are examples, and I pulled this one from Minneapolis. These are examples of how indigenous peoples are balancing native customs with Christianity. And they're making Christianity fit their own worldviews and cosmological, theological even beliefs. Here, the congregants arrive for All Saints Episcopal Indian Mission. handful of churches across the country there. And on the altar, the sweetgrass and the sage, as well as the candles. Here in Oklahoma, we have the uniqueness of, in the Methodist Church, the Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conference, created by the Methodists. Still a separate conference today. In fact, several of our students here at Phillips, alum and current students, have been a part of pastoring some of those Oklahoma Indian Mission churches. This was from their 2020 conference session. Notice the conference was established in 1844, and again, it's still in existence with its own logo. Their website really is kind of amazing with some of the videos that they have with indigenous representation in both preaching and devotionals and things like that. I highlight too as well, Norman First American United Methodist Church used to be pastored by Chabon Colonel, who moved up the ranks in the Methodist Church for Reconciliation Ministries. But you see just from their website, some of their ceremonies that they host, the Fall Gourd Dance, Indian taco sales, always a favorite, wild onion dinners. There's a church here in Tulsa that's having one of those coming up, I think. They host a Muskogee Native singing. Several of the churches around here in the Indian Conference do that. I went to one when I first arrived, and it's long. I mean, you know, plan to give your entire evening to a hymn sing. And the hymns are in the traditional, I mean, they're in the native language, and they're even printed. They have their own little hymnals with the words there. But it's just beautiful to be a part of that experience. The Catholics have their own American Indian Catholic outreach with their own website that's up. Here's from a retreat at Our Lady of the Lake Retreat House in Guthrie. And the Saint Kateri Tekakwitha Honor Dance that took place at the university there in Shawnee, the Catholic University, not the Baptist University in Shawnee, Oklahoma. There's two. When I go visit my mom, I drive up 177 and I get to Ponca Indian Land, and I see the Ponca Nazarene Church, and then I see the sign for the Ponca Indian Baptist Church, and they have their own website. It was established in 1929 by First Baptist in Ponca City, and it is still a separate entity today, doing their own nativity. One of the fastest growing denominations with indigenous people are the Pentecostals. Angela Tarango's book, Choosing the Jesus Way, talks about how Native Americans are really drawn to Pentecostalism because of the expressive body, the dance of traditional culture, and the use of body in the ceremony comes out in the worship experiences with Pentecostals. Her book, though, is very critical of the lack of indigenous leadership within the hierarchy of the structural denominational hierarchy, but the fact that Native peoples are drawn to Pentecostalism. Another growing group or problematic group for some, depends on how you want to look at it, is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which has traditionally taught that indigenous Americans have descended from a group called the Lamanites, who were cursed by God after rebelling against their more righteous neighbors, the Nephites. Am I saying that correctly? Okay. So the LDS Church has really had to struggle with this concept of race and indigeneity. From 1947 to 2000, the LDS Church ran an Indian student placement program taking 50,000 Native children from their reservations and placing them in white Mormon homes. So some of the same things that other denominations were doing, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was also participating in some of that Americanization. They have since repented and talked about that problematic aspect of their culture. There's a book out on that program. It's interesting. There's one band of Shoshone there in Brigham City, Utah, that has the dubious distinction, it says there on their Facebook page, of being the only Mormon Indian tribe in the United States. And so they're proudly claiming themselves to be members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. A lot of racial tension that has existed in the church has been called, it's really interesting, the scholars in the church, the historians and the scholars in the academy writing about race and religion are the ones to kind of bring some of the dialogue out. The University of Utah hosted a year or so ago Indigenous Perspectives on the Meanings of Lamanite. And my friend Farina King was one of those who, she's a citizen of the Navajo Nation and also a Latter-day Saint, and led that conference and trying to have this dialogue about how we can think about how we were treated by Mormons in the early history, and yet how we ourselves are indigenous Mormons and how we can embrace it. And she likes to say that she finds a source of strength in their Lamanite identity, particularly a prophecy that the Lamanites will blossom as a rose. Others will take her to task and say, no, it's a terrible racial stigma that has been cast upon us. But at least they're having those dialogues. They're having those conversations and challenging one another to think more theologically about what this all means. And of course, some of the military conflicts, even with Mormons and indigenous peoples, there's been a call for healing. Oh, I didn't. Did I put that one up? Yeah, a call for healing. Darren Perry with the Shoshone tribe has really been working to have some of those conversations and to discuss a project to develop a cultural and interpretive center on the site of the Bear River Massacre, which was one of the single largest mass killings of Native people in the United States. That land has been returned to the Shoshone Nation, and the tribe is trying to restore the land and the water with native, culturally significant plants in a climate adaptive way. So at least within the Latter-day Saint community, there is some progress to try to have some of those difficult conversations and to try to reconcile. So I put this word up with the question marks, because the reality is, can we really talk about being post-colonial? Colonization is still occurring. Post-colonial is a nice word in the academy that points to a nice, lofty goal. Will it ever be achieved? There have been critiques about post-colonialism. In fact, a lot of women of color who are non-Western talk about how the term itself is a hegemonic part of the hegemonic white woman's movement. It's a masculine construct itself, right? And as Joshua pointed out this morning, we can become ourselves colonizing when we try to tell Native peoples how they shouldn't be Christian because that's such a Western construct. And even though the reality is Your aunties and your family, right, have adopted it. And so the term and the concept of post-colonial itself can become colonizing because we ignore the ways that indigenous epistemological views have made Christianity their own. Because in Western mindset, it's either or between these choices. In a Native American mindset, it's not mutually exclusive, it's both and, right? And for white people, particularly in the academy, or even just the academy itself, even people of color in the academy, to be post-colonial and to say, shame on you for being both and, you have to be either or, is itself colonizing. And so I like the term, and I've had these conversations with some of my other colleagues before too. Perhaps the term instead of post-colonial is to be decolonial as a better approach, because that allows us to accept different worldviews. It decenters whiteness. And those Western definitions of religion, it can start to remove some of those value judgments on those categories of religion and the functions of religion that we use to promote white supremacy still within the systems of the church. And so that's just a push coming from my academic perspective and conversations and thoughts that I have, that perhaps post-colonialism is not the goal, that it is a flawed kind of methodological system, and that maybe even, and when we talked yesterday, words matter, right? And maybe decolonial might be a better way to think about that. And then I finished today with, it's complicated. It's messy. It's complicated. Like I said, that Native American card, fighting for religious freedom with an American flag, and the cognitive dissonance that comes up a lot in my research. And this was one. From the Oklahoma and Indian Territory, U.S. marriage, citizenship, and census records from 1841 to 1947 that have been digitized, and this is specifically for the Chilocco Indian School up in north central Oklahoma. And I know, again, you'll get a copy of this. Letter after letter that's been digitized from people writing to the school. I thought you were only going to keep my children just 3 years. It's been 3 years since, they've gone to your school. I was told now it's going to be another year. How is that? Letter after letter of parents writing, how's my child? I haven't gotten a letter from my child in, a while, can you follow up? And as I'm reading these letters, they're hard to read, but then I get to this one and the stationery that it's printed on. Dear sir, I most humbly beg your pardon. Hope you will excuse me for taking the privilege of writing to you and give you the trouble to attend to my letter. But as I am the mother of one of your pupils at school, I will please ask you why my son, Anika Cisneros, has not been able to write me. I've written to him several times. To the present, I have been anxious to know how he is and how he is getting along. And yet, the stationery reflects a Christian faith. In 1909, when her child was sent to Chilocco Indian School, And this letter just tells me it's complicated. That we really can't understand someone's faith experience and lived experience of what their faith means to them and how they draw comfort sometimes in those images of Jesus and in that picture that's on the stationery. And yet, the heartbreaking words, haven't heard from my son. He's been a student of yours. How's he doing? But it just reminds us again, as you mentioned this morning, Joshua, and the question that I was pushing with you and Orsi and Tweed and some of those who promote this concept of lived religious experience, how important lived religious experience is. And for those allies for indigenous justice, we can be critical of the historical past of colonialism and cultural violence done in the name of Christianity, but we cannot replicate that today in contemporary society by trying to shame indigenous Christians to forsake their own faith and lived experience. That's what it means to be decolonial in our existence together. So thank you.